Okay, it's working. It's good that it just started because we just sent our 6 and 8-year-old out of here when they were having a heated argument over who was going to be the best helper for Miss Elizabeth. So good that I wasn't mic'd when I was trying to referee that. Thank you, Libby. I'm Bonnie Holliday, and I was, up until 9 days ago, your clerk of session, but I've now handed that off to Drew Timmons, who's not in the room, so I feel comfortable encouraging all of you while I'm talking today to think of all the challenges and grievances that you have. And Drew is anxiously awaiting your call as soon as we finish today. My husband, Lee, and I joined Trinity in 2013, and I've served on commitment, I've served as the chair of CFM, and I've of course served on session. And we have 2 little girls, Catherine and Elizabeth, who, if you know them, they go by Kitty and Bess. And when we joined Trinity, it wasn't necessarily a natural choice for us because we didn't grow up Presbyterian, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But we did have some connections to this church. Some good friends of ours got married here. One of them was, now she's Caitlin Jones, but she was Caitlin Goodrich, and she was the daughter of Craig Goodrich, who at that time was still an associate pastor here. And it just so happened that we had bought a house about a mile down the road. So it was close. We had a connection here. And our good friends, the Owens, Laura's maiden name is Strickler, and she also grew up in this church. And so we teamed up with them, and all of us joined at the same time. And I actually have a funny story about that later. So get ready, Owens. But Lee grew up in the Methodist church. He's from Savannah, and his family attended and still attends Isle of Hope United Methodist in Savannah. I grew up, and we'll talk about this a lot today, as a Baptist. And so when we came to Trinity, not everything felt super familiar. You know, there were different songs, certainly, much less blood in the Presbyterian hymns as compared to the Baptist hymns. Different sermon structures, different elements all the way around. But nothing could have prepared me for the affinity that good Presbyterians have for a committee. And in fact, I think the only thing you love more than a committee is a good Baptist joke. And I have heard them all over the years. It's just low-hanging fruit. You all really need to work a little bit harder. When Lee and I joined, we were telling someone, we're about to be Presbyterians. And he was a Methodist and I was a Baptist. And they said, oh, well, it's good that it's happening this way because the inverse could never happen. And we were like, what do you mean? And they said, well, let's just say it's easier to cool down a Baptist than to fire up a Presbyterian. And it's funny because it's true. It's funny because it's true. But I grew up in a very small town. It's called Roopville, Georgia. In those days, when I was growing up, the 80s and 90s, the county in which it was located, the 2 claims to fame that we had were, we had the most miles of unpaved roads in Georgia, and we were the leading cattle-producing county in Georgia. So it's as cosmopolitan as you might imagine out there. But as in many small towns, life centered on the church in town. And in our town, it was the Baptist church. Lee can attest to this, there's one road that goes through town, and at the end of it is Roopville Baptist Church. And that's where literally all roads lead to the Baptist church. So you probably have a picture in your mind about this place and about the way I grew up and about the church and maybe even about my family, just based on what you've heard so far. And you're probably right, whatever you're thinking, with the exception of the family part. On paper, my family, my parents, did not belong in Roopville, Georgia. Number one, they were not from there. They were transplants. That was unusual. Number two, this talk today has nothing to do with politics or partisanship, but this has bearing on the story, so I'm going to tell you. My parents were Democrats, and that was a rarity out there. I think they were the only Democrats in a 70-mile radius. As you might expect, Roopville was a very traditional, very conservative, very rural town, kind of Mayberry-ish. And here my parents were. They weren't even the nice, like, quiet, polite kind of Democrats that they didn't just vote their conscience and go home. I mean, they were, signs in the yard, bumper stickers on the car, letters to the editor. I mean, we were flying our flag. We were a known quantity in our town. And they got into all kind of shenanigans. One of them was they were just very socially progressive, and the example that stands out the most, just to illustrate the types of things that they did, was they led a very controversial but successful campaign to ban Confederate flag apparel in the public schools I attended. Which sounds crazy today, but believe it or not, back then, that kind of stuff was very pervasive. I mean, it was just everywhere. And the Stewarts were not going to stand for it. And so we were just very popular. And, and that also sort of bled over into our church life, this kind of rabble-rousing, primarily because my parents disagreed with practically everything that came out of the Southern Baptist Convention at that time. I don't know if they are still up to these antics, because I have not been tracking the Southern Baptists for a few decades now, but in the 80s and 90s, they were really on a roll. I mean, just who do we want to oppress today? And that was, when I was in maybe 8th or 9th grade, what happens is sort of like a presbytery, although I don't even like to make that comparison because it's so loosely. It's a body that has some governing authority over the churches in the area or in the region. But otherwise, they get together every summer at this convening, the Southern Baptist Convention, and they take up issues that they are going to study and pray about and maybe discern what the right path for the church is. And in those days, it was women and gays. And those were the things. Those were the big things. And we didn't even have the rhetoric that we use now, the terminology we use now. It was literally women and gays. And so the first thing they did was, in one summer, they determined that they were going to call for all good Baptists to boycott Disney, if y'all remember this.
Oh, we remember.
Disney. Disney. The heart and soul of every household in America, what every kid loves, we were supposed to just, say no more, because Disney had gone too far and they had awarded medical benefits to the partners of gay employees. And the Southern Baptists were not going to have that, and so they said to boycott Disney. So that went over like a ton of bricks in our house, and my parents wrote an open letter, as they were prone to do, to the church, and they restricted their offering. And they said, "We are not Southern Baptists, and we love this congregation, but not one red cent that we give is going to that organization." And the only way they could be sure that it wouldn't is to say they could only spend our money on building and grounds. And so I think there was even a line in there like, "You can cut the grass on our dime, but nothing else." And so that was the first shot that they fired. And by the way, now that I've done commitment, please don't ever restrict your tithe. I mean, it is such a nightmare. We do not encourage that. It's just a general offering. But although I guess if the church ever does something crazy, then maybe that's a way to send a message. But the second thing they did that I remember as a kid was they took up the issue of women in the church. And this was like the next summer. It wasn't even like we had time to calm down from the first thing. It was the next summer or maybe 2 summers later. And they were like, we got to be thinking about how women are going to be allowed to serve. Are they going to be pastors? Certainly not. But maybe, like, should they be deacons? And everyone was following along. And honestly, it wasn't even just about their role in the church. It was about their role in life and in their families and in the world. I mean, it was pretty broad-reaching. And after much discernment and prayer, they determined that they had been right all along and women should be subservient. And that was the language that was used. And my mom did not agree. And my dad immediately, because we were kind of watching this, there was some hope that there would be some movement. I mean, maybe it was naive at the time, but I remember, there had been discussions in our house about like, oh, maybe they'll, but it didn't work out. So my dad resigned as a deacon. And, in another letter, and he said, I can't be a representative of an organization, a formal representative of an organization who's this backward thinking. Not just this, but all these other things that have happened, but especially this. I've got a wife and 2 daughters who, in his opinion, were very capable. And there was something in there that my mom had written about if we ever find ourselves in the business of saying God loves this person more than this one, then we've gone the wrong direction. And that just applied to everything that came out of the Southern Baptists at the time. So, but when this deacon resignation occurred, you would have thought it was a true tragedy. People were visiting us. People were praying for us. There were cakes and casseroles showing up at our house. It was like someone had died. And I remember, I was young, but I remember the chairman of the deacons, who we just loved. He and his wife were best friends of my grandmother. They were older than my parents. And he was at our house one day, and he was talking to my dad in the den. And, this was one of many visits that had occurred. And I was listening. He was talking to my mom and dad. I wasn't in there, but and my dad was like, Judson, his name was Mr. Judson Bell, and he said, surely you are not going to tell me that I'm wrong on this. I know you understand. And he said, I'm just not going to change my mind. This is crazy. And Mr. Judson said, oh, I don't care, Robert. And he said, you're my brother. Your family is my family, and I love you, and that's all I came here to say. And I don't know if I remember that story because I was just on high alert, given all the tumult that had happened in our house, and everyone seemed very upset with us, or if it was because that so perfectly summed up the parameters within which my faith was formed in those early years. Because we disagreed, it seemed like, at the time, through the eyes of a child. We disagreed with everyone on 99% of the things. But somehow the 1% that we agreed on was enough, as evidenced in that conversation with Mr. Judson. And I kind of think, based on those stories, that, I was reflecting on what to say here and how on earth I would tell the journey of my faith development. I think there are kind of 2 types of memories that people have. And one of them is the type that is formed through just rhythm and repetition. Those things that you witness so regularly in your life and do over and over again that they almost play like background music in your mind. And then there's another type of memory that forms when something disrupts that rhythm and you remember it because it was different than everything that always happened. And clearly that was the case for me. Because all these things are mixed together. Because for every high-profile deacon resignation that we had in our house, there were also 100 afternoons watching my grandmother and the visitation committee construct and deliver baskets of fruit and coffee to everyone on the prayer list. And they paid actual visits to these folks. They checked in, they sat down, they chatted, and of course they brought goodies every 2 weeks, no matter what, like clockwork, for as long as I can remember. And for every protest offering that we gave in our house, and every open letter we wrote, there was, the glimpse as you drive through town on a Saturday of the men's group who got together and cut all the lawns of the elderly folks in town because they couldn't do it anymore. So for every controversial and confusing thing that happened that I couldn't control as a kid, there was also the steady, faithful service that I witnessed almost subconsciously all the time. And people who served quietly and humbly and never asked for recognition. And they were so easy to overlook. I didn't even clock it really then. I didn't clock that I was observing all these things, but I saw it so often and over so many years. Now it's all that I remember. And for every person who didn't understand us in our community, which was a lot, there was our church family who loved us all the time and all the way, knowing and disregarding our differences. They loved us. So as a young person, I had to reconcile all that. I learned really quickly that labels that the world uses for all of us are almost always too simple to be very meaningful and almost always misleading too. My parents always told me, and this is very on brand for them, until you question a belief, it doesn't belong to you. It's just something someone else has handed you. It's theirs, it's not yours. And that, on that and many things, they were right. And they got what they asked for, by the way, because me, the daughter of these two quirky liberals, grew up and worked for not one but two Republican governors early in my career. So they're hoisted on their own petard with all that analytical reflection that they had me do all the time. But old habits die hard. You know, I even see it now when we join Trinity with our good friends, the Owens. We were in our first new member class, and the very first opportunity that Pam Drizel at the time, she was like, does anyone have any questions? And I was like, we have got to talk about predestination. I can't get right with it. I don't understand it. And I'm going to need to know what that means if I'm going to be a representative of this organization, if I'm going to be a member. And poor Lee Holliday, I mean, he has to go places with me and live through this in real time. We didn't know anyone but the Owens. We were just making friends left and right. But they did explain it in a very loving way that I was able to swallow, and here we are. The rest is history. And, you know, even we have a foundations class. We found a lot of like-minded people, by the way. I'm not the only one that's wrestling with things at Trinity. We started this foundations class for that very purpose, too. It's a group of us that get together. It's peer-led, and we develop a lesson based on Scripture every week. And the person who's in charge of leading the lesson researches it and contextualizes everything that was going on, you know, as part of the story. And then we poke at it. I mean, we ask questions of each other and of the Bible and what on earth could God have intended us to discern from this? And does that make sense for us? And how can we eke out some meaning that we can embed in our minds and hearts? And that's what we do every week in Foundation. So it's just a very natural extension for someone like me. Because we try to make, we wrestle with questions and we try to make them make sense in our own way. But growing up the way that I did, the daughter of Southern Baptist social justice seeking rural Democrats, I never had the luxury of being surrounded by people who thought or believed just like I did. But the blessing of all of that is that I learned at a very early age that I can love and be loved by all kinds of different people. And what a gift to know that despite all our shortcomings and disagreements, God is still able to love us through each other. And it's because of those people that I grew up with that seemed so different in so many ways that I serve in this church now. And I'll tell you another story that happened recently involving banana pudding. The Holy Smokers did, we had the barbecue a couple weeks ago. The Holy Smokers did a great job. Thank you to all of them. And as part of that group, Lee and Tom Adams came to the church on Saturday and made 4 or 5 hours worth of banana pudding. I don't know the quantity, but I know the time invested. I know there were hundreds of bananas sacrificed in the making of that pudding. And when Lee got home, he told me that Tanner, Tom's daughter, had been up here helping them. And when I heard that, and y'all, Tanner is y'all know her. She's the cute, home from college, like the cutest, most fun. She had 100 things that she could have done that day. And she was up here slinging pudding with Lee Holliday and her dad. And when Lee told me that, I found Tom the next day. And I was like, bless Tanner's heart. I was like, that was so sweet of her to help y'all. Please thank her for me. And Tom, I don't know if you remember this, but he said, it's good for her. And he said, I tell all my girls, the church is us. There's no one else to do this. It's us. God calls us to do this work. Even if it's serving banana pudding to our brothers and sisters in Williams Hall, that's, that the church is us. There's no one else to do it. And what a beautiful legacy Tanner is to Tom, and that Tom is to his parents. And it's funny, but when I serve in this church, I feel close to those sweet people that I watched serve in mine all those years ago. And I aspire to be their legacy, just as I hope the children we're raising in this church will be ours. Because as Tom said, the church is us. And that means sometimes that we all have to wrestle with some uncomfortable things sometimes. And we have to say yes to service, even when we're tired and even when no one thanks us for serving. We have to show up for each other. And we have to find ways to get along with each other, even when our differences are on full display. In the name of God, we have to do it. And there's a poem that I read to session recently, and I have it memorized simply because it is top of mind all the time these days, because the world seems like a very confusing place. But don't worry, it's titled in 150 characters or less, so it's not long. It's by Nikita Gill, and it reads something like, everything is on fire. But everywhere I look, the people I love are doing beautiful things and making a life worth living. And I know I don't have to believe in everything, but I believe in that. And that's all I have today. And this is a very Baptist way to end it. I'm choked up and emotional because we always keep our feelings right here at the surface, just always ready to openly weep. So that's really, I know we're probably out of here early today. If y'all have any questions about, the craziness of Southern Baptists, I'm happy to answer it. But yes.
The issue of women in the Baptist church is on the agenda this year as well.
Well, and last year was when, I think it was last year, it might have been 2 years ago, when they kicked out some of the churches that had sort of been breaking the rules because of a very historic precedent, and they kicked them out because they had women pastors. So it's coming up again, huh? Well, I'm waiting with bated breath to see what they decide this year. Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah, I was struck by what you said about the commonality, that 1% commonality. I don't think we have a whole lot of dialogue going on with the Southern Baptist side wing of our church in America. Is there an opportunity
It depends on what your threshold for, or what your tolerance is for things that, I have a really high tolerance for it, because here's what I was telling Session. I gave a devotion recently sort of about all this. And because I just never grew up around people who were like my parents, but even in their differences, I saw that they were good. My friends' parents were good. They had goodness in them. And our church, even though, I understood that all these things that the big church was doing were bad, I saw our church, and it had so much goodness in it that somehow those things in my mind are not mutually exclusive categories, that, you can see people and that by all accounts you should have nothing in common with, but my life experience has taught me that there is still goodness there. So it just depends. It just depends on what your tolerance is for understanding that deep down some of those folks might be willing to change. It might be willing to overlook differences. I think the bottom line is the more we're around people that are different from us, the better off we all are. Because if we're only always around people who think like us, it's much easier to other someone, to say, what in the world are they thinking? What are they doing? And we still do that. I'm not saying I don't do it, but I guess I don't have an answer for how we engage with people who make crazy decisions like that. But to know that there are individuals within that faith community that don't ascribe to that. And maybe it's just part of their faith tradition. Maybe they're comfortable in the Baptist church, but that's not their bag. That's the way it was in our church. There were so many congregants who, they didn't, in fact, their lives and the way that they lived their lives and the people that they loved in their lives, they proved all those points wrong. They didn't have any. We had gay people in our church. But then you think about it, you step back and you think, how? How was that possible? And I don't know the answer to it. I really don't. Clearly, I ended up here. It's not somewhere that I could be as an adult. But I do think that it's never okay to write people off. Because a lot of them, that's not what they're about. I wish I had a better answer.
Ma'am?
Bonnie, what did you do for the 2 Republican governors?
Oh, I was, so for Governor Perdue, so here's the thing. I wanted to work in public policy, and spoiler alert, if you want to work in public policy, you're probably going to have to work with some Republicans in Georgia. And so for Governor Perdue, he had an education office that was called the Governor's Office of Student Achievement. It was kind of like a shadow DOE, because at that time we were coming off of, this is a way back for some of you, Linda Shrinko was a former superintendent in Georgia who got in some trouble and some little embezzlement. And so Governor Perdue started his own education agency. And so I worked there for him. I led that agency. And then for Governor Deal, he was very interested in charter schools. And so I led the State Charter Schools Commission when Governor Deal was governor.
Which was your background?
Yeah. I did a lot of work in there. Yes.
Bonnie, and a lot of us here are not of an age to have been able to be in the foundations class, because way back the first time I was on adult ed, we started a class called Roots, which I think grew into the foundations class. I'm fascinated by it. And I want to know what you think about the ways that it is encouraging young people like you and your peers to be at Trinity and stay at Trinity.
Well, we joke. In fact, I gave Rebecca a really hard time because she calls, she doesn't do this on purpose. She was doing it to synthesize things, but she was like, if you want to dialogue about some contemporary issues, you go to Connections. If you want to go to a lecture and learn from this, Emory professor, you go to this class. And then if you want Bible, you go to Foundations. And so we were like, Bible? Is that it? Is that how we're being tagged? If you want Bible, you go over there. But it started not subversively, but we did meet. Tom and I started, we met with Andrew Escada in the dark of night at the manse one evening and just said we'd really like a class, almost like it's a Bible study. That's really what it is, because a lot of us, especially at our age, our schedules don't really allow for us to be in circles. And I know a lot of people get that content and that kind of study from a circle, but we all work, and so it's difficult, and when we all have small kids, so even during the evenings in the week, it's hard because they're running everywhere. So we were like, we would like to use our Sunday morning hour, because if anyone is desperate for spiritual enrichment and trying to eke meaning out of the Bible, it is parents of young children. And so we asked if we could use that Sunday morning hour to just do a peer-led study. Now, sometimes, and I do think the unintended benefit, and I know that there's pros and cons to age and stage classes, and this was never intended to be one, but we do capture a lot of people who are, 30s through 50s. And in that class, an unintended benefit is when we get new members, they often come to Foundations and they get to meet people pretty quickly and form relationships in a much more organized way than like Lee and I did, which was just bounce around from class to class. And a lot of the things we were attending weren't very discussion oriented. They were, really brilliant content, but we just didn't get to talk and meet people, and we were new and didn't know anyone. So it has that benefit, and I do think, and we have pretty, steady attendance, like 15 to 30 in a given Sunday. And the other thing it does is because we all take turns teaching it, we show up for it because I don't want to let Tom down. If he's prepared a lesson, I got to go because he's put a lot of time, and you really do research the topic. You're the expert that week. So I think that has something to do with the sustained attendance too, as we feel because we have to teach the next week and we want somebody to be there as well. Sometimes though we get out of our depth, like we ask for Presbyterianism 101 because we do bump up against questions that we are not prepared to answer for each other. And that's part of the fun of the class too, is, it's not like we're always there saying this is it and this is how it goes. But we've already asked for another special session this spring called Jesus is on the Loose. And it's all the times that Jesus appeared after he was crucified but before he ascended. Because it comes up every year in our whatever scripture we're studying around Easter. Jesus is just popping up everywhere. All of us every year are surprised because it's yet another appearance of Jesus to someone somewhere that in all of our years at church we had never heard of before. So we did ask Lucy and Rebecca to help us figure out a Jesus is on the Loose curriculum and talk to us about where was Jesus and what all was he doing in those days before Ascension. So everyone is always welcome in Foundations, but especially for stuff like that. Esther.
I'm interested in your studies. How did you come to public policy? Was that partly because of your parents, or was that because you were, what was the...
I want to say yes, because here's the other, when I was a kid, my parents, like most kids would wake up in the morning and their parents would let them watch cartoons or whatever, and this is not a joke, and Lee can tell you because he's met them and now he's part of this. So we would wake up and my dad would be like, so, I'm in like third grade, what do we think about apartheid? What are we gonna do about apartheid? And I would literally, in the morning, first thing, and my mom would be like, leave him alone, Robert. And he would, but those are the kinds of things we would talk about all the time. Those were our family dinner discussions. It was a lot of it all the time. And so I do think that I was sort of trained at an early age to think about, ways that you can go about changing the system without taking it to the streets, and, ways you can affect positive change in an organized way. And that's part of it. And then I started my work as an English teacher because I was an English major. And you can either go to law school or you can teach. And so I taught high school English, a lot of Julius Caesar. And then at that time, when I was teaching, there was a lot of federal education reform. George W. Bush was president at the time, and there's a lot of accountability requirements that were very top down. They actually did some good things, but at the time it seemed very restrictive. And so I started doing a lot of studying about, how maybe site-based management was a better approach to ed reform because it was embedded in the community and based on the kids you're actually serving. And so that led me to sort of charter schools, and so then I did a doctoral program, excuse me, and that led to all these other ed reform. I mean, ed reform has sort of been the place where I live in state policy.
Bonnie, I have one question. As our outgoing chair, as we move into a new year with a new chair, clerk session, what are your words or wisdoms or hopes for Trinity? That you hope this group of amazing people help come along and work with you in the next year?
I think just showing, you're all here at 9 a.m. on a Sunday, so this is not the group that needs the words of wisdom. But, I think just being super inclusive and seeing when someone's not here, and in a culty, invasive way, reach out to people and say, I didn't see you and I missed you. I wish I had seen you. This thing was so funny and or this thing was so great, this thing was so interesting and you would have enjoyed it. It's not really rocket science to get people to church. We all want community. And this is the best community we could have. My grandmother used to say, there's no friend like a church friend. And that is so true. We all need church friends. And so just doing that organic outreach but that involves really caring about people, and I know you all do. And that's a circle that continues to get bigger the more that we do it and the more that others do it.
Thanks. That's a good word.
Yes?
Why did your parents move to that town?
That is a good question. The answer is they were in their college years. They graduated from high school in 1969, and they went to the University of Georgia. But my parents were hippies, as you might imagine. Everything. We didn't eat preservatives growing up. We had chickens. We were eating brown eggs way before it was cool. I didn't understand. Now every hipster in Atlanta is doing it, but back then it was this is so lame. So they wanted they got married young in college. They transferred from the University of Georgia to what's now the University of West Georgia, but at the time it was West Georgia College in Carrollton. And they wanted a lot of land so they could grow their own food and have their own chickens and do all these things. And what do you know? Roopville's got land in spades. And so that's where they ended up, and that is what led to all these crazy stories. In so many ways, my sister and I are like, y'all are just gluttons for punishment. You voluntarily put yourselves here, but it has shaped so much of the way we view life and others and, our philosophy for everything. And certainly influenced my faith. Yes?
There wasn't a Methodist church?
So there was a tiny Methodist church in Roopville proper, but it didn't have enough congregants, and they met quarterly. And so, and my parents are and were, they were Christians, and we were at church all the time. So that wasn't gonna work. We were Baptists. I'm glad we got around to that, because to me that's the first question: is what were y'all doing there? Thank y'all so much. Thank you.